A couple of weeks ago, a paper was published in American Political Science Review with the title Political Legitimacy, Authoritarianism and Climate Change. And it started with a question: is authoritarian power ever legitimate? And it continued like this: the contemporary political theory literature, which largely conceptualizes legitimacy in terms of democracy or basic rights, would seem to suggest not. I argue, however, that there exists another overlooked aspect of legitimacy concerning a government's ability to ensure safety and security. He goes on to say that climate change poses a grave threat to public safety and therefore legitimacy may require an authoritarian approach. While unsettling, this suggests the political importance of climate action. For if we wish to avoid legitimating authoritarian power, we must act to prevent crises from arising that can only be resolved by such means. This sort of argument is something that I think we're going to be hearing more and more of. So, let's have a look at what's coming. When this paper appeared, as you might expect, some were quick to jump on it, claiming that the author was arguing for eco-authoritarianism today, tomorrow and always. So, for instance, this piece by Anthony Watts: Cambridge University is pushing for tyranny in the name of climate change. I think that's pretty unlikely in terms of Cambridge University, although it's red meat for his audience, no doubt. I do note that the author, Ross Mittiger, responded to equivalent claims on Twitter saying this: "At no point do I call for dismantling democracy. Quite the opposite. As I stipulate in the intro, my paper is meant to be a warning about the threats climate change poses to democratic governance and human rights." So, okay, let's start off taking his word on that, keeping a clean slate without presumptions, and look at what the paper actually says. As ever with a longish paper, there's always a danger of cherry-picking certain phrases and leaving context and caveats behind. We will do our best not to do that, and there's a link to the full paper in the video description so you can check it for yourself. At the start, Mittiger notes the cautious but growing chorus of praise for authoritarian environmentalism. For instance, he references this paper by Mark Beeson from 2010, The Coming of Environmental Authoritarianism, which looks at East and Southeast Asia and concluded this: the dispiriting reality may be that authoritarian regimes, unattractive as they may even prove more capable of responding to the complex political and environmental pressures in the region than some of its democracies. Elsewhere, Beeson put it in even more uncompromising terms: if the environment continues to deteriorate, good autocracies like China may become not only justifiable but essential for the survival of humanity in anything approaching a civilized form. And this is typical of the sort of discussion that we're talking about, where people say that while of course we think authoritarianism is terrible, the plus side is that not being encumbered by democratic procedures or constitutional limits on power is actually an asset if you need to take urgent action. Mittiger says that it's an empirical question whether authoritarian governance is better able to deal with environmental outcomes, but he seems intuitively to have come to his own conclusion on that question. So he says this: it is undeniable that nearly all wealthy democratic states have failed to respond adequately to the climate crisis. By contrast, various less affluent authoritarian regimes have been successful in implementing stringent climate policies, and several are now considered global leaders in the production and installation of solar panels, wind turbines, batteries, and the adoption of electric vehicles. Always beware people saying that something is undeniable and then presenting no evidence to support it whatsoever, because what he's presenting here as undeniable is actually pretty extraordinary. He's saying that democratic states, which include most of those that have set hugely ambitious net zero by 2050 targets, have failed to respond adequately. Well, if you're an eco-campaigner, your definition of such terms will be variable and always out of reach of governments whose politics you don't like. But when it comes to the rate of planned reductions, the UK, the EU and the US are pretty much in the lead. Now, we might drop the US from that, given Biden's likely inability to deliver on his promises, but even so, And you just know that the positive comparison is supposed to be with China principally, global leaders in the production of clean tech. And it's true that China's authoritarian government has been able to push ahead quickly with developing and promoting some of the important technologies of the future. He missed out nuclear power, by the way, but there you go. But China at the same time has been building new coal-fired power stations expected to peak its huge emissions by 2030 only, although that may come forward a little, and only to get to net zero 10 years later than the rest. You can play all the ifs and buts you like. There's a nuanced discussion to be had with all of that stuff. But to suggest that it's undeniable that democracies have failed and authoritarians are doing better is just laughable. When we look at the big authoritarian states of the 20th century, we generally see an appalling environmental record. The fact that people on the ground have a powerful incentive not to feed bad news back up the chain of command means that they rarely respond to negative impacts until it's too late. So we saw the draining of the Aral Sea by the Soviet Union. So we saw Chairman Mao's disastrous Great Leap Forward, where they pushed agriculture to deliver more and made it impossible for anyone to point out how it was abjectly failing. Partly because the land didn't produce more in the conditions the party was insisting on, and partly as well because genius Mao had encouraged his people to kill all the sparrows so that they didn't eat the seed, not realising that they mostly ate the pests that otherwise feasted on the growing crops. Tens of millions of people died in Mao's Great Famine as a result of that one. But sure, authoritarianism is excellent for the environment. Now let's be fair. The proponents have their preferred examples as well. So they compare deforestation of mangrove forests by relatively democratic Senegal and, until 2016, repressive dictatorship for Gambia. This study was one that used satellite imagery to compare and found that while authoritarian Gambia had lost 10% of its forest, Senegal had lost 43% of its. The Gambia, of course, is a tiny country, the smallest on mainland Africa, and if you have a despot who decides to prioritise a certain thing, then yes, they can push that thing through. But it's firstly the fact that the vast majority of despots focus on gaining and holding power, not on enlightened environmentalism. Once you create a system that runs on the operation of coercive power, you select for leaders prepared to use such power in the most effective way possible. And historically, almost none of those turned out to be remarkably civilised or enlightened, since that would actually be a disadvantage in that sort of system. But secondly, the problems we saw with the Soviet Union and China were because they were pushing such a system to scale, and that's where the impacts kick in. Now, all of these are anecdotes. My anecdotes cover big events involving large systems, but they're still just individual anecdotes. And the Senegal, Gambia example doesn't have the scale, but again is just an individual anecdote. Any of them may prove to be the exception rather than the rule. So really, you need to systematically analyse whether democracies or autocracies govern in ways that would be better calibrated with protecting the environment and or tackling climate change. Whether they exercise more prudence, use data rather than guesswork or hearsay, and how that plays out across all countries, not just a couple looking at individual events. This was addressed in the creation of the Intergenerational Solidarity Index, which uses 10 different indicators including carbon emissions, education quality, child mortality, use of renewable energy and more. A review of all the 122 countries for which data was available sufficiently to create a score enabled you to plot the results against the level of democracy for each country as measured by the VDEM Liberal Democracy Index. It's not remotely ambiguous in its conclusion. 21 of the 25 high-scoring countries are democracies, 21 of the 25 lowest-scoring countries are autocracies. You can't use that sort of measure to prove cause and effect, to be fair. There may be other factors in play, but the apparently intuitive argument that authoritarians are better to climate action is not supported by the data. I would take a stab at guessing that it's largely because the green authoritarianism case posits remarkably enlightened despots acting for the best interests of their people and for the planet. You should only need to look around you to notice that it's not a description of authoritarians in action. No, not in China either. Really, look at the whole picture, not just the bits that suit your case. Now, all of this has been something of a distraction when it comes to Mittiger's paper, because he notes this discussion, displays his presumption without supporting evidence, and then moves on, because his interest is in talking about legitimacy, not effectiveness. But it seems to me you can't really do that. I mean, if we all agree that authoritarianism is bad, and if there's no evidence it would actually be more effective, why would anyone in their right mind go there? You can't decide not to answer that question if you're talking about legitimacy. There could only ever be legitimacy if it was genuinely better. But okay, having noted that, let's move on back to the paper. Mittiger makes the case that government legitimacy comes in two forms, what he describes as foundational legitimacy and contingent legitimacy. Foundational legitimacy insists that citizens' essential safety needs are met. He says that it's foundational in the sense that no government can be legitimate unless it satisfies this demand. Contingent legitimacy, on the other hand, comes from power being used by government to be, in principle, acceptable to those that are subjected to it. What is or isn't acceptable is always a matter for debate and can change significantly depending on the circumstances. Hence, certain actions are widely tolerated or accepted during time of war or indeed pandemic than they would be at other times. That's why the legitimacy is said to be contingent. And it's here he makes the point that I already mentioned. The argument presented here should not be understood as an endorsement of authoritarianism, but rather as a warning. Should we wish to avoid legitimating authoritarian politics, we must do all we can to prevent emergencies from arising that can only be solved with such means. But then he follows with a punchline, which is why we're even having this conversation. Lamentably, this is not always possible. Climate change is, or may very soon become, sufficiently grave and disruptive as to jeopardise foundational legitimacy. And herein lies the allure of authoritarian environmentalism, for if, as many now contend, liberal democratic norms, principles and institutions impede urgently needed climate action, then legitimacy may permit or even require relaxing or abandoning those constraints. I have to say, I'm not much taken by the "gee, it sure sucks," but even though we find authoritarians distasteful, the circumstances might mean we have no choice argument. I'm not a mind reader, but such arguments look to me like a fig leaf to cover up something you want to do anyway, but can only be done if you wring your hands and say how much you really don't want to do it. And this line about, well, if we don't get on top of this issue now, then we might regrettably be pushed into it in the future, that reads as a process of normalising the idea now for future adoption. The suggestion that speech is dangerous is massively overblown, but I would hold that seeking to build a societal acceptance for authoritarian rule is probably the sort of speech that we could actually genuinely describe as dangerous. Because we've seen time and time again through history that it leads to some pretty dark places. Now, he then goes on to explain why recent history has shown that the pesky old democracies have demonstrated themselves to be unfit for purpose when it comes to the climate, and it's rather instructive. Democratic publics have, on multiple occasions, defeated via referendum or protest, even modest carbon taxes. Free speech rights in many countries have made regulating harmful climate denial and disinformation campaigns virtually impossible. Likewise, the primacy of individual autonomy has at times rendered even minor interventions, e.g. around light bulbs, fuel efficiency standards or diets, extremely contentious, and more ambitious policies like population control totally unthinkable. In other words, it's not just that we expect you to agree to the objectives we have to achieve, signing up to net zero targets for instance, but we insist you embrace our preferred policy mechanisms. And if you don't, we want the power to cram them down on you anyway. If your carbon taxes provoked protests, maybe they weren't well designed for that moment. Political ineptitude is a thing. If free speech is so irksome, perhaps it's worth remembering that the ability to freely challenge bad policies has been one of the engines that makes policy better, and is probably one of the things that put democracies at the head of the index I just discussed. And take your minor interventions. Light bulbs, you say. You're using light bulbs as an argument for authoritarianism. But the original low-energy light bulbs were rubbish. The ability to say so meant that companies were pushed to innovate and come up with better ones. And now nobody objects to LED light bulbs. And then you're saying that you want to dictate people's diets. But a lot of environmentalist contentions about food impacts is debatable at best and often driven by ideological preferences, not pragmatism based on climate impact. Mentioning that as one of your lead issues is an excellent reason never to give governments the power that you want them to have. And as for population control, Paul Ehrlich would have enforced population control in India in the 1970s given the chance that you wish he should have had. Instead, they had the Green Revolution, and they thrived significantly more as a result. Authoritarian, knee-jerk solutions kill innovation, crush the human spirit, and almost always fail to meet their objectives. Other than that, they're a great idea. And of course, the other issue here is that the examples of traditional situations where populations may tolerate a higher degree of government authoritarianism tend to be visibly urgent and short-term. Climate change, however, is a long-term complex problem. It is nothing like anything the human race has ever faced, and that feeds an evolution of this argument. I argue further that as climate change is likely to be disruptive for a long time, it may also cause a more permanent reconfiguration of contingent legitimacy standards. That is, the climate crisis may not just lead to temporary and localised suspensions of, for example, democratic processes or individual rights, but precipitate a more substantial and enduring shift in what counts as an acceptable use of political power. Once you accept that argument, you say goodbye to democratic norms and set off on a brave new journey into a world where governance is based on coercive power. Not in a crisis, but forever, or at least until the citizens rise up and overthrow the dictators. And given the high-tech example of control that China is developing, you should expect that to be a harder prospect than it used to be. He then goes on to explain why he believes that the current situation means that we may have little choice. First and most obviously, climate change confronts us as an emergency of effects. As the most recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change IPCC report shows, unequivocally, climate change is already causing massive displacement, agricultural loss, famine and drought, extreme weather and novel health crises in many regions and states. Without sufficient action, these and other extreme events will become consistent and crippling global phenomena by the end of the century. Sorry, I'm not convinced that your tendency to bedwetting is a wholly sound argument for abandoning democratic norms. The IPCC report did not say that things were so dire that we should embrace our inner eco-fascist. In spite of current effects, world life expectancy is higher than it has been through most of human history, agricultural productivity likewise, famine is associated with failed governance and not climate change, and so on. There are problems that we have to deal with. Noting these facts is not to argue with potential future impacts, but the IPCC report is consistent with some of the commitments governments are starting to make, and the expectations that governments improve those commitments over time is strong. Those are democratic governance in the main, of course. So why does declaring war on the legitimacy of democracy strike you as a great thing to do right now? I mean, it's an argument that makes zero sense. And the lack of credibility in this argument comes out in the next paragraph. Indeed, according to a likely conservative report from the World Bank, we're on track for a 4°C warmer world by 2100. Well, that's interesting, because after COP26, most commentators believed that we'd moved the needle all the way to something like a 2.4°C outcome, with the expectation of further movement to come. Look at the reference. And the World Bank report that he's talking about is from 2014. Really? This paper is published in 2022 and you're saying things are going to be really bad based on a 2014 report, which has been supplanted by huge amounts of research and work since then. I mean, that report even predated the original Paris Agreement, never mind what's come since. What are you talking about? At this point you realise this is simply cherry picking, pulling out the figures that look the worst to justify the unjustifiable. If you're not going to do the serious work in getting the nature of our current situation accurately described, you're certainly in no position to be prescribing the radical medicine that everyone needs to swallow. None of that, again I say, is to underplay what the current science does show. And he then matches that to time urgency. We need to be acting now, which indeed we do. And increasingly indeed we are. Never enough for the activists, of course. They would hate it if we were able to innovate our way to a society that was net zero in impact, but otherwise broadly the same as it is today. Mittiger describes his imagined required alternative. The necessary policies, which would almost certainly involve enormous public investments, and so new taxes or sovereign debt, along with expansive restrictions on individual behaviours and consumption, are not likely to be popular. You think? And may indeed inspire considerable resistance among both the general public and negatively affected industries. Yes, indeed, I have been talking about climate change for decades. I support net zero policies, and I will be on the barricades fighting you on this one. And if I'm the first against the wall, then look at the French Revolution and understand you will be following shortly afterwards. But that wouldn't happen though, because what Mittiger and others project is an enlightened despot. So long as people with ideas like theirs, good technocrats perhaps, so long as they're the ones in charge, then it will just be the necessary policies that otherwise selfish people wouldn't put up with. He puts forward a few such policies. None of them are a big surprise based on how activists see the world. For one, governments might impel citizens to make significant lifestyle changes. One pertinent example concerns curbing meat-heavy diets, common in the global north, given the enormous carbon footprint of animal agriculture. Should we mention at this point that Ross Mittiger is vegan? Do we think that he's done the work on the various alternative options by which meat production might see its impact reduced? I'm guessing possibly not. Is it possible this isn't about reducing carbon emissions, but instead about cramming down on people who choose different lifestyles and values to your own? Well, at least we're free to say so. Oh, wait, hang on. There's his next suggestion. We may also imagine a censorship regime that prevents the proliferation of climate denialism or disinformation in public media. This may well conflict with standard conceptions of freedom of expression or of the press. Again, however, to the extent those freedoms have been exercised in ways that have undermined and continue to undermine effective climate action, such censorship may be warranted. Bear in mind, this isn't just about broadly accepted scientific realities, even assuming it's acceptable to censor on those grounds, which I don't agree with, but it's against anything that supposedly undermines effective climate action. In other words, opposing anything that our enlightened despot might want to do that could in any way be justified as being for the climate. Well, as you know, despots can usually justify anything they want, knowing that no one dares to contradict them anyway. And the great thing is that you can organise that while still making it look like you have a democracy. Governments might also justifiably limit certain democratic institutions and processes to the extent these bear on the promulgation or implementation of environmental policy. This could involve imposing a climate litmus test on those who seek public office, disqualifying anyone who has significant relational or financial ties to climate-harming industries or history of climate denialism. And here's that good authoritarianist China again, with Hong Kong showing such an inspirational example of this in action, where government-approved candidates are the only ones who get to stand for office. But of course it would only be done on the basis of climate change, so that's okay. And he finishes like this. This again is not exhaustive of what authoritarian environmentalism may entail. Now indeed, you've forgotten rounding people up and throwing them in jail, if they're lucky. I've had environmentalists in comment sections on some of my Extinction Rebellion critical videos saying that they looked forward to the ecocide Nuremberg trials when people like me would be brought to account. I have no doubt about it. The point that these people simply don't understand is that once you create a system of governance that operates by coercion, you create a system that naturally selects for leaders that are willing and skilled in the use of violence for the process of holding and exercising power. As I said before, well, look, I don't mean to be unkind, but if you're arguing for authoritarianism, too bad. Such a system is never going to favour the vegan soy boys who write about authoritarianism as though it can be a fine-tuned tool in the hand of enlightened technocrats. Once climate change has furnished the excuse to give up the mechanisms of accountability, authoritarian leaders will then be able to use that power to do what authoritarian leaders have historically most commonly done, which does not involve taking robust action on behalf of the environment. How can you not understand that? Within a very brief time, Ross Mittiger and probably Roger Hallam would be put into the chains still warm from when they were on my wrists, and then taken to the gallows, probably slipping on my blood on the way up and staring grimly into my accusing dead eyes, looking up at them from the basket below. All right, a little dramatic, but you get the point. Throughout human history, we have struggled with the darkness of what humans are capable of when they're given power without consequence, without liability. This is not a climate governance tactic to be fine-tuned. It's a rabid beast that you unleash at your peril. We used to understand this. Climate change is not a single variable problem. It's a practical issue that we seek to solve while preserving and promoting our other primary values, which includes freedom and self-determination. You do not get to decide that your lazily judged presumptions about our situation are so self-evidently correct that you gain the right to put your preferences over the expressed will of a majority of citizens. You'll notice that I started off with a blank slate, accepting the author's plea that he wasn't arguing for authoritarianism but warning of it as a consequence. And I've become more and more energetic in response as we've gone on, because that is not supported by the text of this article at all. Unfortunately, this is going to be a recurrent theme, I predict. There are few arguments more deserving of robust rebuttal than these ones. By the way, I mentioned that the loose interpretation of the science is a contributing factor to these arguments. I did a video recently looking at the key points of the latest IPCC report, where we discuss what it did and, just as importantly, what it didn't say. Since it's an important part of this whole debate, if you've got this far, you might want to look at that video next.